Should the U.S. consider military intervention to stop Mexican drug cartels? So here's the overview. Recently, on an episode of Meet the Press, presidential candidate J.D. Vance said that he believes that American presidents should have the power to deploy U.S. military against Mexican drug cartels. He said, "I want to empower the President of the United States, whether that's a Democrat or a Republican, to use the power of the U.S. military to go after these drug cartels. We have to recognize the Mexican government is being, in a lot of ways, destabilized by the constant flow of fentanyl." Earlier this year, Congressman Morgan Luttrell introduced the Jalisco Cartel Neutralization Act in the House of Representatives. The measure would require the Department of Defense to establish a strategy to kill or capture Jalisco cartel leadership and provide a report to Congress on their progress. Luttrell said, "This legislation makes clear that the Jalisco cartel cannot remain emboldened at our border and that the United States military must be ready to engage and eliminate the Jalisco cartel. Should it be determined the best course of action is to use armed forces of our great country." In an interview with Fox News last month, former President Trump said that strikes against Mexican cartels should absolutely still be on the table. What are your thoughts, Mike?
Wow. Yeah. I mean, look, a lot of the gangs and a lot of the threats to American national security have to do with cartels, not just in Mexico, but in South America. And obviously it's harming and killing a lot of Americans. I mean, you have 110,000 now 2 years in a row dying from drug overdoses, which include 90% of that statistic being fentanyl, which is mostly brought across the border by cartels. I have like the instinct in me out the gate. I want to be like, let's go. Like, this is something that we should have did a long time ago. It's time to go to war. But I also know what that means. And you know what that means.
Yep.
The authorities and the approvals and the logistic nightmare that would likely create a larger national security risk, I think, to our country and second, third order effects than the J.D. Vance's idea of easily, I imagine, Black Hawks and Little Birds flying across the border and smashing these targets, satellites, geolocating and tagging and using signal intelligence to drop bombs on bad guys. However, we also have to remember, one, it's not just Mexico. I mean, MS-13 is a great example of that. But if we go to war with the cartels, they already have likely millions of people infiltrated into our country who would potentially be proxy agents to operate on their behalf. Guys who are couriers, facilitators, henchmen, just bad dudes who are just quiet because they're just pushing the drugs, who might get orders to create chaos and calamity within the country. Now, what's difficult for me to wrap my head around is in something so catastrophic as the national security issues that we're dealing with the cartels, how do you address it? If we don't have a diplomatic solution in conjunction with a national strategic and potential counterterrorism solution, nothing's going to be accomplished because it would be a war through attrition. We'd kill the top guy, and just like me and you saw in Afghanistan, Iraq, they'll replace him they'll replace him the same day, in the same moment that person is killed. So it's like, what do you keep doing it? You kill the top, and then you create more bad guys that are willing to fight for the cause. And the next thing you know, we're at war with Mexico. At least that's how my strategic brain looks at it, unraveling. And that could be troublesome and worrisome for future national security considerations for the future. It sounds sexy in my mind. Like, I imagine J-Stock would be celebrating the day that happens, but it also is going to be a lot of trouble that if we don't think comprehensively about it, we might end up in more serious issues.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I'm looking back at this overview, And yeah, from a tactical perspective, I'm right where you are. You're thinking, oh, wow, look at the bases that we have in Texas. We'll surge the 160th there. We'll rotate assault squadrons through. Instead of being on standby, you just go to Texas and you're banging targets south of the border, right? We're just going after the cartel. But, you know, what Morgan Luttrell introduced, to me, that is more of like a planning in theory, it seems like. They have to establish a strategy first, trying to look at the feasibility of this. But the line that sticks out to me, we have to recognize the Mexican government is being, in a lot of ways, destabilized by the constant flow of fentanyl. I have been very fortunate to do a lot of episodes with people talking to me specifically about the cartel south of the border. There are cartels all over the world, but I'm talking specifically in Mexico. And what's not in that sentence that I believe should be in that sentence that tells a much more accurate picture is that not only is the Mexican government being in a lot of ways destabilized by the flow of fentanyl, I think we need to look at how willing and participatory they are in the fact that the cartels exist. You cannot talk about this issue without talking about corruption. And the people that I have talked to who make their living talking about cartels say that corruption is widespread. So yeah, is it destabilized? Sure. But are they also part and parcel, whether they are turning a blind eye, being paid off, a combination of those things? We have to look at all of those things because these cartels are not operating inside of a vacuum. And also, specifically when it comes to the issue of fentanyl, this gets even more complicated and a global issue when you start working upstream or where are these source chemicals coming from. It is an open secret that they're coming from China. They are arriving at ports in Mexico that are, you know, surprisingly enough, manned and equipped by Chinese personnel making a handoff of these items to the cartel, which then can put them together. And of course, they are sourcing them north. But none of that is happening in a vacuum. So yeah, it sounds sexy, but we're actually talking about something that is geopolitical in nature. And as much as I love putting a breaching charge on somebody's door and getting your job done, I don't know if that is the solution to this. And I've heard this conversation framed through the lens of also, should we declare the cartels as a terrorist organization, which in my understanding would actually give the DOD the authorities that they would need to do for cross-border operations or kinetic operations against the cartel. But as you mentioned, you know, it's cutting off the head of one snake, it's replaced. And are we only going to go after the cartel sources on the ground, the agents on the ground? I mean, I live 60 miles from the Canadian border, and I know without a shadow of a doubt, just in talking with my local and federal law enforcement friends that I have in the area, that we have cartel members that are active in the state of Montana. So it goes back to that issue of what direction would these people get if we were to declare them a terrorist organization. On the other side of that, when these people are rolled up, I think that we would probably have an ability to treat them with a little bit more of a heavy hand, because right now it's largely catch and release because they're not a terrorist organization. They may be an illegal or undocumented individual, and states are handling those issues very differently, right? But again, if they're a dedicated and declared terrorist organization, I think you'd have a much more likely opportunity to at least imprison or export out of the country if possible. But it is not. I wish it was as easy as, okay, hey, let's just make a JPEL list, right? Let's put together a targeting list and start at the top and bottom of this. Are we going to go after their money? Are we going to go after the politicians that allow them to facilitate this south of the border and that have incredible influence north of the border? It is not as easy and as precise as it may sound. And like you, the last thing I want is a protracted war with our southern neighbor along the U.S.-Mexico border.
Yeah, facilitation is the first thing I thought about when you mentioned Luttrell's comment about Mexico. I'm like, for sure, there's a lot of facilitation of the cartel, and for good reason. It's economics. I mean, it's the economy. I don't think Mexico would be accumulating the amount of cash and thriving in some ways like they do if it wasn't for the drug game that obviously is feeding the biggest consumer of those drugs, which is America, the United States. I mean, just being to Tijuana recently and talking to some of those guys on the ground and listening to the crime statistics, where over thousands of people die in Tijuana every single year in one city. 75% of all arrests recently reported by the New York Post, 75% of the arrests are from illegal immigrants now in the New York City area, to include Manhattan. And you look at that stat and you go, oh man, well, who is it? It's a whole bunch of different people, including gangs. And I know that that's one of the subject matters that we plan to talk about, but it's like we are infiltrated beyond 11 plus million, somewhere the number at a minimum is 11 million, by a whole bunch of illegals that don't have jobs, can't get jobs, came here, and some of them are affiliated with gangs and are rolling together in gangs, committing crime already. And what happens when, again, your origin country decides, hey, the gloves come off, it's time to go to war? When your boss calls you and says, hey, they've designated as terrorists, so if you get rolled up, you're a terrorist, change your plans. And that would be something I don't think we'd ever seen before. I mean, Al-Qaeda was a formidable foe because of their capability and capacity to operate throughout the globe. The cartel in counterterrorism and criminal circles that counter these guys are looking at these guys and respecting them the same, because they have all the capacity and all the capability. The things they do, you don't want to mess around with those guys. And if the gloves do come off, you want to bring the heavy hitters to make sure that you're invested in the fight. We're already stretched so thin across the globe because we're involved in all these things. And we're spending billions of dollars while we're running up a, $34+ trillion deficit. And we're not in the position to franchise another campaign of war on our Mexican border. However, I think, cooperation with the Mexican Authority and Mexican government is a different thing. Small surgical strikes is a different thing, but a full scale, let's go to war with the cartel, I don't think it's smart. And if I was in charge, if we were in charge, it probably wouldn't be the best course of action.
I also wonder, I mean, I only speak for myself, but at this point, the last thing I want to see is the United States involved in another kinetic campaign, another war where we don't define what the end state is going to look like. We don't define our criteria for ending it, and it just goes on and on and on. And what's interesting, and what we didn't have to deal with in Iraq or Afghanistan, is we were there purely from a Title 50, Title 10 responsibility, right? We were there to execute and engage military operations, which we could do that south of the border, and the DoD could if they wanted to. But is U.S. law enforcement equipped, trained, and ready to be actioning terrorist designated targets inside of the United States in addition to their already full roles and responsibilities? Because we know the established lines that the cartels use, they are not unknown. Their technology is changing a little bit, but we know broadly the paths that they're using, the mechanism that they're using, whether it's human trafficking. People should Google some of the unbelievable tunneling that has been done. They're using like oil, and and I'm not talking like tunneling straight ahead. I'm talking complex routes where they're just using to move drugs or money or whatever it may be. We can handle that from a DoD perspective south of the border, but when this intelligence is then derived for people of interest, targets of interest inside of the United States, I mean, is that the role of law enforcement? Or then do we get into this really weird Pasi Comitatus place where maybe JSOC, just go ahead and hit that target in Arizona, just this one time. It's going to be okay. I mean, that's a slippery slope in and of itself.
Yeah, that's a fear of mine too. I kind of see what happens in Australia and the United Kingdom, where I've heard stories of commandos and special operations guys in those countries, from both the civilian perspective and also the commando perspective, of kind of how that lack of post comitatus regulation affects the civilian population and also affect the operators on the ground. Like the SAS is a great example of that, being able to surveil and conduct counterterrorism operations in their own country. If
Canada has it too.
Here,
Canada has it with JTF too. They have their internal charter for counter-terrorist organizations.
Yeah. And I wonder, like, we talk about stretched resources. Like, what does it look like when the entire country is saturated with potential threats? And then what is the process in which we're looking at these target sets? I mean, how many dry holes did we hit from bad intel where we arrive and it's like, oh, this isn't even the right house. So, there's nobody here. Or there's a family there and we're like, oh, my bad. Like, sorry about your door.
Only
so
almost every night.
Yeah. I mean, it's just the nature of the job. And imagine that happening here where civilians, I mean, it happens with law enforcement where these civilians are trying to defend their own life because they don't know what's going on. They wake up at 2 a.m, somebody's banging on their door or somebody's roaming around their front yard with a flashlight. And then they have a gun in their hand and they wind up getting shot through the doorway or through the slot in the doorway. And I'm concerned about that. And certainly with that proposed strategy, we would be seeing something like that because the reality, like you said, law enforcement is already stretched thin with all the chaos that's going on in the streets of America. Imagine adding an entire other variable that they're potentially not trained for, and that would completely task that traitor.
Yeah, it would be rough. And in the same breath that I caution against it, internally myself, I'm not against strategic strikes across the border like you mentioned. I think, looking at this from a strategic perspective, that attacks on infrastructure it may have an impact. And when I say that, I'm talking about probably fixed wing or even, sensor-based platforms attack. I'm not talking about taking people across the border unless there was some incredible reason that we would need to do so. I think bottom line, the solution to this is much more like a multi-tool than it is a scalpel. As sexy as these things sound, even if they were actioned exactly as they sound, it wouldn't solve the problem. And I think that's the issue with bullet points and talking points like this. They sound good, but in the reality, if you take a more broad look at the holistic problem that both countries are facing, I think both countries are suffering from fentanyl, both Mexico and let's not forget in this too, the cartels are not exactly the nicest people to Mexican citizens either. They just wield, the biggest stick with an iron fist. So it's an issue that both sides of the border are facing. And I think it's an issue that's going to take cooperation and collaboration with both sides. The issue being, though, if the corruption in the Mexican government is as deep as the people who have reported it to me, you have to be a little bit more cautious with your collaboration. Because what you don't want is to actually be educating your enemy on what it is you're going to be doing first. But bottom line, it is an issue I think that deserves far greater attention, and I wish it was as simple as these talking points.
Yeah, agreed.
Order now, the 2 women who were killed and found dismembered in Juarez on Sunday were from El Paso.
On the southern border, there is a legal concept known as reasonable fear, a lifeline for those fleeing violence.
A Texas couple was found tortured and murdered.
Police say so far this month, 11 women have been killed in Juarez.
And then their bodies or body parts offered up to Santa Muerte as an offering. She represents death.
In this special Borderland docuseries, I take a deep dive onto true crime stories. Join me as we uncover the truth about the fear behind the crisis.
A group of powerful people participating in a pedophile ring.
Never been seen before in Mexico.
We ended up rescuing almost 200 kids.
The discovery of multiple women in mass graves.
They're almost in every state.
When you put it together, you have an economic extortion map.
But even more violent.